The winter wind rustled violently through the bare, dried-out branches, carrying the scent of cold earth and the ashes of some distant, extinguished fire. The forest, in the last stretch of winter, felt like a forgotten world, silent, devoid of visible life, filled only with wind and the memories trapped in long, dead, brown leaves. Walter Briggs lay face down beside a fallen tree, his aged body trembling with every breath. His worn, tattered uniform was ripped at the shoulder, stained with mud and blood. His skin had taken on a grayish hue, and his breathing came in strained gasps, as if something was slowly tightening around his chest. Fever burned him from the inside, making his eyelids heavy, as if every blink might be his last. But he wasn't alone. Scout, a German shepherd with dark gray fur and intelligent, deep brown eyes, stood beside him like a silent sentinel. His coat was damp with forest dew, but his stance was unwavering. He crouched low, licking Walter's face gently, slowly, patiently, as if calling him back from the edge of the abyss. Walter opened his eyes. The first thing he saw wasn't the forest. It was those eyes that said nothing, but carried everything he had lost. Trust, friendship, life. Scout, he whispered the name, a breath broken in half. Scout barked once, short, sharp, resolute. Then he turned his head, nose lifted to the wind. His head moved slightly, ears perked up, catching something in the air. A faint, faraway scent, but full of hope. Then, without hesitation, Scout lowered his head, grabbed the strap of Walter's backpack in his jaws, and pulled. Walter groaned in pain. The sharp sting of broken ribs shot down his spine. But Scout didn't stop. He pulled again, harder this time, and barked toward the forest's edge, where dim light filtered through the trees. Just under a mile away, St. Mercy Nursing Home. Scout looked at him, as if to say, "Come with me. We're not done here." Then he turned toward the light, walked a few steps, and paused, glancing back. Walter, with what little strength he had left, pushed himself off the ground. His legs trembled. He braced himself against the tree. Every step was a war, but Scout watched him closely, ready to come back and support him if he faltered. They had no one but each other. Walter took one step, then another. His feet dragged through the damp soil. Scout stayed ahead, but never more than 3 steps away. Every so often he'd glance back, eyes narrowed with concern, ears twitching with each of Walter's labored breaths. On the ground, their footprints marked the trail, one pair unsteady, aged and worn, and 4 steady paw prints beside them, leading the way. As they neared the forest's edge, the wind softened. The scent of antiseptic, wet wood, and fireplace smoke drifted into the air. Scout stopped, stood tall, and looked toward the glowing glass doors ahead. Beyond them was St. Mercy Nursing Home, a place unfamiliar to both, but in this moment, the only heaven they could hope for. Walter collapsed. Scout spun around instantly, pressing himself close to the old man, growling low, urging him on. Then, he did something no one had taught him, no one had commanded. He ran toward the glass doors, pushed against them with his body, then turned and barked, loud and urgent. His bark echoed in the night like a cry for mercy. Lights flickered on inside. Shadows moved. A nurse shouted, "There's someone out there, and a dog?" The doors slid open. Scout walked in, head high, steps firm. Behind him, Walter stumbled in, a ghost drifting through the veil of life. And so they entered the light. An old, crumbling soldier and a nameless dog, with no papers, no training, just love. We didn't come here to die. We came to remember how to live. The lights from the St. Mercy Nursing Home's awning cast a glow onto the patchy snow, illuminating Scout's tall frame, thinned from hunger and cold, and the stumbling figure behind him. The forest's sound seemed to hush as Scout approached the glass sliding door. the final barrier between life and the death that clung to each of Walter's faltering steps. Scout stopped in front of the cold glass, his eyes gleaming with something more than instinct, something urgent, the awareness of a soul that knows what's about to be lost. He lifted his head and barked once, then gently pushed against the door with his body, just enough to make noise, but not harm. Inside, through the thick glass, 2 night shift workers stared. One dropped her hot coffee, the liquid spilling across the table like her heart had just overflowed. The other gasped. "My God, there's a dog out there, and an old man!" Scout bumped the door again, harder this time. A low growl followed, a call, not a threat. The lobby lights glinted off his eyes, making them flash gold. And in that moment, no one saw just a dog. They saw a guardian at the gates, demanding life for the one fading behind him. The doors slid open automatically, as if they too sensed the urgency in the air. Scout didn't hesitate. He turned sideways, bracing his body under Walter as he had throughout the entire forest trek. Walter, legs trembling, leaned heavily on him, one hand clutching the thick fur at his neck like a blind man gripping his last beam of light. Every step echoed on the cold tile floor like a silent plea. "We have walked through hell. Now, please, let us stay among the living." The lobby fell silent. A young nurse froze, her pen dropping with a loud click. An older orderly stood paralyzed, phone still to his ear. Everyone in the building seemed suspended in a nameless state, shocked, moved, unsure. Scout's eyes scanned the room, then stopped at the reception desk. He looked up, slowly, steadily. No fear, only a silent plea. Don't ask questions, don't judge, just help him. Karen, the night shift head nurse, was the first to move. She stepped forward slowly, hands outstretched in peace. She'd worked in medicine for nearly 20 years, seen many emergencies, but never a dog delivering a man to the doorstep of life like this. "It's okay," she whispered to both man and dog. "I'm here to help." Scout locked eyes with her. Then, with the faintest motion a nod, if a dog could nod, he stepped back just half a pace, just enough to show trust, but not enough to leave his post. Karen reached Walter just as he began to collapse. His breathing was shallow, lips pale, the scent of forest and blood rising from him like the smoky remains of some distant, painful past. She cried out, "Call emergency! We've got a critical patient!" The facility snapped into action. A gurney rolled from the corner. Medical staff rushed in, but their eyes never left Scout. The dog now stood between them and the old man. Not barking, not whining, just solid and alert, like a soldier on his final watch. Walter was placed on the gurney, IVs and monitors attached in quick, practiced movements. As the nurses raced alongside the cart, Scout moved to follow, only to be stopped by a guard, arm out in reflex. Scout let out a low growl, not from aggression, but from desperation. His eyes burned with worry and grief, as if to say, "I brought him here, don't make me leave him now." Karen saw it. She motioned to the guard. "Let him come. He's not leaving that man." As the emergency room doors swung open, Scout trotted inside, stopping only at Walter's bedside. He sat down, noble and still, eyes watching every drip line, every heartbeat monitor. No one saw a stray dog anymore. Scout had entered that space like family, and no one dared argue otherwise. Some arrive in sirens, some on stretchers, and some walk into life on 4 quiet feet and a heart that never gave up. Rain began to fall steadily outside the window. Tiny droplets tapped gently on the glass frame, as if trying to awaken a memory that had been asleep for a very long time. The atmosphere inside the emergency room was stiflingly still. Each beep from the monitor struck like a slow metronome, marking the fragile life of the man lying there. Walter Briggs, former Marine, 72 years old, bearing not only physical wounds but also shrapnel buried deep within his mind. Scout lay beside the hospital bed, his head resting gently against the mattress, eyes unblinking as if ready to pull Walter back if his soul tried to slip away. Then Walter began to tremble. A slight convulsion passed through his gaunt shoulders. Sweat broke out on his forehead, though the room was cool. His dry, cracked lips parted, releasing a mix of moans and words, like he was speaking to people no longer alive. In his subconscious, he was back in the searing red plains of a foreign land, where he had once led a 16-man unit through brutal combat. Fires burned around flattened bunkers. Bullets zipped overhead like swarms of insects. Thick smoke billowed from an overturned armored vehicle where a young soldier lay still, eyes wide open in disbelief. A panicked voice crackled through the radio. "Fall back! Immediately! The position's surrounded!" Walter turned and saw Tyler and Jenkins, the youngest in the squad, just 19. They were trapped behind debris, unable to move. Their eyes weren't filled with fear, only hope placed squarely on him. "Captain, don't leave us!" Tyler screamed, voice breaking under the shell fire. But orders were orders. A decision in 1 second could cost the lives of the other 14, or the lives of those 2 boys. He chose the 14th. As he turned away, the screams behind him carved into his heart, a sound that hadn't faded to this day. In the hospital bed, Walter moaned and writhed. His arms clawed at the air as if trying to pull someone from the ashes of an invisible battlefield. His heart monitor spiked. Nurses outside took notice. But before they could rush in, something unexpected happened. Scout climbed onto the bed. No one had taught him to do that. No one gave a command. But guided by something deeper than training, a primal instinct born of love, the German shepherd gently climbed up, careful not to disturb the wires and IVs. He laid his head over Walter's chest, where the old man's heart thrashed wildly. A low growl rumbled from Scout's throat, not fierce, but deep and slow, like a lullaby, like the steady drumbeat a soldier once heard while marching across dew-soaked hills soaked with blood. And then, strangely, the heartbeat on the monitor began to settle. Not completely stable, but less panicked. Scout opened his eyes. He didn't look away from Walter's lined, sweat-drenched face. He didn't know what war Walter was reliving. But he knew this. The old man needed an anchor, something to keep from being swept away. In his fever dream, Walter wasn't on the battlefield anymore. He sat curled beneath a tree in the forest, burning with fever, a loaded pistol heavy in his hand. That was a year ago, on a rainy whiteout night. He had meant to end it all, until a dark shape approached silently. No barking, no noise, just amber eyes glinting in the mist. Scout? The dog had sat beside him all night, in the rain, licking his hand, resting his head on Walter's lap without asking for anything. No fear of the gun, no suspicion, no judgment. Walter hadn't pulled the trigger. From that day on, he had one more reason to live. "My boy?" The words left his lips in a faint whisper. Nurse Karen, standing outside the room, froze when she heard it. Though the soundproof glass muffled almost everything, Walter's lips moved, shakily, with unmistakable clarity, as if the name itself were a secret password, unlocking the untouched part of his soul. Scout's tail wagged, barely. He didn't need to understand everything humans said. But that name, that voice, he understood. It was the thread that tied 2 lost souls together. He edged closer, pressing his chest against Walter's arm, their heartbeats slowly falling into sync. Outside, the rain kept falling. The old maple tree in the courtyard rustled in the wind, like a veteran standing in silence before a fallen comrade's memorial. In that sterile white room, there were no stage lights, no applause, just an old soldier fighting ghosts of the past, and a dog, plain and quiet, refusing to let go. Not all who serve wear rank. Not every soldier is human, but loyalty sometimes beats strongest in a heart that cannot speak. After a long night in the ER, when Walter's fever began to subside and his heartbeat returned to normal, Scout still wouldn't leave his side. He lay curled at the foot of the bed, head resting lightly on the pillow, as if to ensure that when Walter woke, the first thing he'd see would be his boy. Outside, dawn broke gently. Pale winter sunlight slipped through the blinds, casting a thin beam across the white floor. There was a unique stillness in the air, not because the hospital was quiet, but because everyone was quiet for the dog. Scout didn't sleep. Though his eyes stayed half-closed, his ears twitched with every nurse's step. Each time the door opened, he lifted his head, scanning, then relaxed only when he saw there was no threat. There was something in his gaze that made passers-by look back. A young orderly named Jesse, who'd never liked dogs, couldn't help but grow curious. While Karen checked the IV, Jesse crouched beside Scout, holding a clean towel to gently wipe the damp fur around his neck. But then she stopped. Beneath the thick coat, near the left ear, she spotted a faint tattoo, a half-crescent moon. Jesse looked up and whispered, "Karen, come here. Look at this." Karen stepped over. The moment she saw it, her expression shifted from curiosity to shock. "I've seen that before," she said quietly, placing a hand to her chest, as if to steady her pulse. Jesse frowned. "What is it? Just a cute tattoo?" Karen shook her head slowly. "No, that's a mark. A K9 military unit identifier. Every service dog has a tattoo. Letters, numbers, or symbols. The crescent moon's rare, but I remember it. I saw it once while training at the eastern base." The air seemed to freeze. Scout, though still lying, twitched an ear, as if he realized his secret hadn't been uncovered. It had been unlocked. Karen knelt, bringing her eyes level with Scout's. She stared deep into those amber-brown eyes, not just wise, but human-like, guarded, tired, proud. "You're not just any dog, are you?" Scout didn't react like other dogs. No bark, no dropped ears, no signs of submission. He simply stared back, silent, aware, as if weighing whether to trust this human again. Karen turned to Jesse. "No collar, no chip, no ID. But if he served in the military, why hasn't anyone come looking for him? Why was he wandering alone in the forest? And why, out of all places, did he lead a dying veteran right to the one spot that could save him?" The question spread like a slow fog through the hospital. Staff whispered, passed it along. "That dog used to be a soldier. Then, he's a K9 who got left behind. Then, he saved his last comrade. Only one didn't say a word, and didn't need to. Scout. He stayed where he was, silent as a shadow, but the kind of shadow that guards your sleep." Later that morning, a nurse scanned Scout with an RFID reader, hoping for a chip, a clue. Nothing. No signal. No data. Just that crescent moon tattoo, and the eyes of a soul who'd seen more than any animal should. That afternoon, Karen brought him a clean towel and a bowl of warm water. As she set it down, she whispered, "No one knows where you came from or why you brought him here. But if you were a soldier, then you're still on duty. Just in your way." Scout glanced at her. No tail wag, no show of gratitude. Just a quiet sip of water. Then he turned and sat back at Walter's bedside. Same spot, same posture. That night, in the nursing log, Karen wrote one line. Patient, stable. Heart rate, steady. Condition, still delirious. Special note. No family. Has a four-legged friend doing better than any doctor. Some secrets don't need explaining. Some warriors don't need medals, just a look and a place to come home to. The next morning, pale sunlight streamed through the window of Hospital Room 7, casting a thin beam over the blanket draped across the body of the man inside. Dust motes floated in the air, shimmering like ash left behind from an old battle no one could quite remember. Who won? Who lost? Scout was still at the bedside. He didn't fully sleep, only closed his eyes to conserve energy, but every sense was taut, steel tight, waiting for the first movement from the old soldier. And then, just as the sun rose above the hospital roof, Walter opened his eyes. No dramatics, no groaning, no outcry, just a quiet awakening. Slow, heavy, and deep. His pupils narrowed at the light, but his gaze was murky, hollow, as if he'd woken, but his soul hadn't yet returned from a dream that refused to end. Scout lifted his head the instant Walter stirred. No barking, no rush forward, just a quiet step closer, gently pressing his nose to Walter's hand. Walter turned his head. His eyes softened. Not much, not enough to call it emotion, but just enough for the onlookers to notice. In those cold, worn eyes, a small crack had formed, letting a faint light through. Karen was the first to enter, having heard he was awake. She stepped in quietly, each footfall like she was entering sacred ground. In her hands, a tray with warm tea and a small medical logbook. But her eyes never left the sight before her. An old soldier and a German shepherd, simply looking at each other, in a stillness so complete it made the outside world seem frozen. "Mr. Briggs," she called, gently but clearly. Walter turned his head, still weary, but lucid enough to focus. He didn't answer. Karen was patient. "You're at St. Mercy Nursing Home. You were brought here last night by—" She glanced at Scout. "Your friend." Walter didn't look at Scout. He just exhaled, slowly, as if he'd been waiting to hear those words. Then he nodded. Not to anyone else, but perhaps to himself. Karen continued. "We haven't found any identification. The police are checking missing persons reports. Can you tell us your full name and if there's anyone we should contact?" Walter stared at her. For a long time. There was no hostility in his gaze, no defensiveness, just the still stone of a man who'd been asked too many questions he never got to answer. "I don't have anyone," he rasped. His voice was dry, coarse, like gravel soaked in rain. Karen paused. A simple sentence, but it carried the weight of a life. She nodded without pushing further. "What about Scout?" Walter met her eyes for the first time. "He's everything." Just 4 words. But as he spoke to them, the entire room seemed to lower its voice. Scout wagged his tail softly, without excitement, like a quiet pledge of loyalty drawn into each breath. From that day on, Karen began paying closer attention to the bond between these two strange patients. Every time a nurse took Walter's blood pressure, Scout would make a slow lap around the bed, then return to his post. When 4 drips were connected, he lay at Walter's feet, resting his head on the covered toes like a living pillow. And whenever Scout gently nudged Walter's hand with his nose, no matter how hard Walter tried to stay stoic, his features would soften. Just a little. Nothing else could do that. Not morphine. Not soothing words. Only that single silent touch from a voiceless creature could calm the storm inside a man who had left everything between life and death. Karen had seen elderly couples care for each other on their deathbeds. She'd seen children cry beside unconscious mothers. But there was something different about the quiet affection between Walter and Scout. Unspoken, unneedy, unbreakable. A pure understanding between 2 survivors who had found each other in the rubble of the world. At the end of her shift, Karen wrote in the nursing log, "Patient Briggs declined to provide personal details. No aggression, no signs of mental instability, displays deep emotional detachment. Note, strong emotional attachment observed between patient and dog, Scout. Connection exceeds normal pet behavior. Recommendation: do not separate the 2 under any circumstances unless medically necessary." She closed the logbook and glanced into the room one last time. Scout was asleep, his head resting against Walter's feet. The old soldier lay on his side, eyes closed, left hand dangling off the bed, barely grazing the warmth of Scout's fur. In that dimming twilight, there was something deeply peaceful in the scene, as if life, no matter how fractured, could still be pieced back together, just by the presence of a creature who knew how to wait and never walk away. The old soldier didn't say much, but the dog by his side told the entire story, with a look, a breath, and a promise to stay. After 3 days in the hospital, Walter slowly regained strength. His external wounds began to scab and heal. The wound inside, the vast, silent chasm, remained untouched. But to Karen and the nurses, one truth had become clear. Scout was not simply a companion. He wasn't just a pet. Scout moved like a trained guardian, always maintaining a protective perimeter between Walter and strangers, his eyes never leaving the man, not for a second. So when that man walked into the hospital lobby Wednesday morning, Scout reacted before the receptionist even spoke. He wore a black baseball cap pulled low, a dark jacket, and sunglasses, even though the lobby lighting was dim. He didn't walk fast, but each step was deliberate, like he had memorized every corner of the building. Karen happened to be walking past the front desk when she heard the man's dry, clipped voice. "I'm here to ask about a patient, Walter Briggs." The receptionist frowned, checked the registry, and replied professionally. "Sorry, we don't share patient information with outsiders." The man didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there waiting. And then Scout appeared from the right hallway. He moved slowly, deliberately, ears erect, eyes sharp like blades. No one called him. No command was given. But something in him, something honed through years of life-or-death instinct, knew, this isn't right. Scout stopped a few steps from the man. His eyes locked on him, as if he had caught a scent from long ago. A dangerous one. "That's Mr. Briggs's dog," a nurse muttered. The man tilted his head, lowered his glasses slightly, just as the light revealed part of his tanned face, a scruffy jaw, and a small scar under his left eye. Scout growled. Low, deep, steady. The kind of growl that doesn't rise, doesn't bark, just rumbles like the engine of a tank crossing a war zone. The man smirked, a half-smile colder than the forest winds Walter once battled. "He remembers me," the man muttered under his breath. Scout stepped forward, blocking the hallway that led to Walter's room. His posture locked in, legs coiled. A guardian is fully activated. And perhaps the most terrifying part, he didn't bark. He just stared. Through the man, as if he'd seen him in a nightmare. Karen rushed over, alert. "Is there a problem?" The man turned to her, his voice suddenly soft. "I'm an old friend of Walter's. Just here to visit. Name? Jack Mason." She checked the intake records. No such name listed under Walter's file. Of course, Walter hadn't listed anyone. Karen pressed her lips together. "Without confirmation of your connection, I can't allow a visit. I'm sorry." Mason didn't protest. He nodded, that cold smile never leaving his face. Then he turned and walked away, slowly, like someone who knew not to cause a scene. Scout didn't move. He didn't blink. He watched Mason until the door closed behind him. That night, Karen reviewed the security footage. What sent chills down her spine wasn't Mason's presence. It was that he had been there days before, standing outside the hospital gate, not doing anything, not trying to get in, just watching. Every time Scout had been taken outside for fresh air, he was there. A few times, Scout had barked out of nowhere. No one had seen anything. Now she understood why. She exhaled, sharp, cold, then wrote into the care log. "A man came today asking for Mr. Briggs. No confirmed identity. Scout reacted strongly, stood guard, and growled. Status, heightened alert. Recommend increased security. Do not separate Scout from the patient." In room 7, Walter seemed to sleep. Scout lay at the foot of the bed, ears alert despite closed eyes. He knew danger wasn't always a knife or a gun or a virus. Sometimes danger walked on 2 legs, and carried with it the scent of darkness from a forest Scout had once escaped. And Scout had sworn, with every instinct and every day spent beside this man, "No one touches him while I'm still here." Some souls terrify evil by simply standing between it and the ones they love, especially when that soul walks on 4 legs and has never left. As the last veil of night faded, lifting like a thin blanket to reveal the damp corners of a new day, Walter opened his eyes in silence. The fever had eased, leaving his body dry and brittle like charred wood. His eyes were still clouded, but for the first time in days, they had direction. There was something he needed to do the moment he had enough strength to sit up. Scout, ever vigilant, was already awake, resting his head gently on the edge of the bed, those deep brown eyes still and silent like a dark, still lake. As Walter stirred, Scout exhaled softly and moved closer, his shoulder brushing the mattress, as if waiting for Walter to remember who he was, and why this dog had never left his side. Walter gestured toward the old backpack on the chair by the window, the only thing he'd brought from the forest, aside from his life and the dog beside him. Karen, checking the IV line, stepped over and placed the backpack in his lap without asking anything. She had grown used to the weight of his silence, like a locked iron door sealed behind decades of unspoken memories. Walter opened the bag. Inside were items that seemed meaningless: a rusted folding knife, a coil of paracord, a scuffed lighter so worn the star insignia on its casing was nearly invisible, a threadbare handkerchief wrapped around a blurred photo of a woman holding a newborn, both faces faded, washed away by time and rain. Then his hand froze. He rummaged through the contents, layer by layer, unfolding fabric as if peeling back old memories. But the small, moss-colored notebook was gone. It had been hidden at the very bottom, wrapped twice in a plastic sleeve. A small notebook, frayed at the edges, heavy not from pages, but from what it held. Walter went rigid. His throat constricted like a wire had wrapped tight around it. His hands clenched the bottom of the bag, released, then searched again. Once, twice, over and over like a panicked child tearing through ashes for the only toy that survived a fire. No, it can't be, he muttered. Scout instantly stood upright, his posture shifted, ears up, body tense, his eyes widened, radiating sharp awareness. He sniffed the air, turned toward the window, then lowered his nose to the floor, circling the room with an urgency rarely seen in him. "Scout?" Karen called, concern rising. But Scout didn't respond. He bumped the table edge, scratched at the bed frame, ran to the supply cabinet, then backed away, growling, low and steady, not in panic, not in rage, but with the rumble of something that had sensed an intruder. Karen saw it. She stepped back and looked at Walter. "What's going on?" Walter swallowed hard, voice brittle as dry bark. "The notebook's gone. It was taken." Karen froze. "You mean someone came into your room?" Walter didn't reply. He looked at Scout, still tracing scent trails on the floor. Then he nodded slowly. "Last night, while I slept, someone was here?" Karen immediately requested a review of the security footage from the West Wing, the least trafficked in the building. But between 2:04 and 4:19 a.m., the feed was blank. No power outage, no system error. Just a clean cut, perfectly trimmed like it had been planned. Scout stood in front of the monitor, head tilted, ears raised, listening to the silence. Then he turned back toward the hallway and let out a deep growl. Not at any person, but at the shadow still lurking somewhere unseen. Karen shivered. Back in the room, Walter sat still on the bed, his gaze casting a long shadow across the floor. Karen remained silent for a moment, then sat beside him on the edge of the chair. What was in that notebook? Walter didn't look at her. His eyes settled on Scout, who had returned, now resting his head on Walter's lap. Names, dates, routes, things moved through the forest. Weapons, medicine. Once, even people. They thought I was just some old hermit hunter. But I saw, and I remembered. Karen took a deep breath. Who are they? Walter's fist clenched, tendons rising like rope. I don't know their names, but I once overheard them on the radio. A group. Called themselves the Orchid Circle. I don't know what they are. But I know one thing. The moment they find out I'm alive, I'll be hunted. He looked down at Scout. But now they'll know. I'm not alone anymore. That night, Scout didn't sleep. He didn't curl up at the foot of the bed. He lay at the door, head on his paws, eyes open, still and alert, like a wordless guard post. And in the soft lamplight, Walter whispered, so faintly only Scout could hear, "If I have to run again, I know I won't be running alone this time." Scout didn't move. He simply exhaled, not from exhaustion, but as if to confirm, "I knew that before you did. Some evidence is written in ink, but some truths live only in the memory of a weary man, and the unwavering eyes of a dog who's never known how to betray." That night, the light in room 7 stayed on, not because of a medical emergency, not because Scout had sensed a stranger again. The light remained, gentle, golden, and warm, like a small beacon refusing to let darkness swallow a room where a life story was finally ready to be told. Karen sat by the window, cradling a cold cup of tea, eyes resting on Walter, the old man whose wrinkles came not just from age, but from forest wind, from war, from grief that never found a place to land in the past decade. Walter leaned back against the headboard, his breath still rough, eyes adrift through the misted window pane. Scout lay between them, his head on Walter's legs, his body tilted slightly toward Karen, as if to say, "This isn't just his story, it's mine too." No one spoke for a long while. They simply sat, 3 quiet souls, connected not by words but by a silence that had ceased to divide, becoming instead a quiet bridge across unhealed wounds. Finally, Walter spoke. His voice wasn't quite storytelling, more confession. "I used to have a cabin, deep in the woods, almost 7 miles from the main road. No electricity, no plumbing. But it was quiet, no horns, no news, nothing. And no one." Karen nodded gently. She didn't interrupt. "I went there alone after the accident." He paused. His eyes lowered, like the memory was still too raw to touch, even after 10 years. "My wife, Sarah, my son Danny, hit by a truck driver who fell asleep at the wheel. I didn't make it in time. They died that same night, in the rain." No sobs, no tears. But the entire room seemed to sink, like even Scout held his breath for a moment. "I was a soldier, but after that I didn't know who I was. I had no one. I thought if I disappeared into the forest, I wouldn't have to see anything that reminded me of them. So I went." Karen slowly set her tea down. On the floor, Scout remained still, ears tilted up, catching every word. "At first the forest was a friend, a remedy. I hunted, built traps, took notes in a small journal. I survived on memory and silence. Each day passed like a wound that didn't deepen, but didn't heal either." He exhaled, voice rough like cold ashes. "Then a few people came, said they were lost, brought supplies, rice, flashlights, solar chargers, traded for small things I had. Then they came back, more often." Karen looked up. "Who were they?" Walter chuckled. Hollow, dry. His eyes held something old. Not fear, but bitter recognition. "We didn't use names. They paid me to move things through the forest. Sealed bags. Bundles. I didn't ask." He stopped. "Until I opened one. Ammunition. Different calibers. Military slang scribbled on notes. Another time it was heroin. Rock form. I had been wrong too long. I thought I lived alone, so no one would be hurt." Karen whispered. "And you stopped?" Walter nodded. "I refused an order. Said I was tired. I was done. I thought that was it." He closed his eyes. But Scout could see what Karen now sensed. The fear wasn't from the past. It was from what lay ahead. 3 days later, I returned to find my traps destroyed. My cabin burned. A fawn I'd raised from a baby. Dead. They didn't take it. It was a message. Scout let out a faint whine, soft, like wind through pine. Karen felt it, the way animals feel grief. Deep. Wordless. That's when I started writing it all down. Everything. Times, directions, license plates, phrases they used. I thought if I die, at least the truth stays. Karen went still. Her hand rested on her chart, not to write, but to steady herself. "And then I met him," Walter said, placing his hand on Scout's head. His gaze softened, for the first time, like something had touched him that didn't tear him open. "A scrawny dog," Starved. Afraid. I left food. He didn't eat. Only approached when I left. Took 2 months before he'd lie beside me. Then one day, I was caught in a trap. Passed out. When I woke up, he was lying across my chest, his head resting on my heart. Karen whispered. Scout. Walter nodded. No one sent him. But he found me, and he hasn't left since. That night, after Karen quietly left, Walter didn't sleep immediately. Scout lay at the foot of the bed, eyes open. Walter spoke softly. Do you know why I survived? Scout turned his head, eyes calm. Because someone, who didn't speak, didn't push, and never left, chose to stay. He bent forward, touching his forehead gently to Scout's. A gesture no one had seen from Walter with any human. Scout didn't move, just closed his eyes, breathed. And in that moment, Karen, who had returned for the blood pressure monitor she forgot, stood outside the door, frozen. She didn't step in. She didn't want to break something too fragile, too beautiful, and too rare in a world where quiet loyalty was in short supply. Some things can't be written in a notebook, but they carve themselves into the heart, by the gaze of a dog who stayed not out of command, but love. After the door closed behind Karen and the hallway lights faded to black, only Scout remained by the foot of the bed, bathed in fractured golden light from the bedside lamp. Walter didn't sleep. His eyes stayed open, clouded like a camera lens left untouched for years. But they weren't fixed on the present. They drifted back, deeper, farther, to a place where a wild dog and a broken man first touched through the curtain of a quiet forest rain. Not everyone has a moment that changes their life. Even fewer remember the exact night it happened. But Walter did. He remembered every detail, every sound, every drop of water that soaked through his collar and chilled his skin. It was a bitter night at the end of November, when the sky looked like a wound leaking cold blood. Rain poured down on the forest like nature itself was mourning what humans had run out of tears to grieve. He sat alone in a hand-built shack, walls mildewed, roof patched with rusty tin. The rain struck the metal like a drum beating against his hollow chest. Beside him, a half-empty bottle of cheap liquor, and a pistol, cold, heavy, silent like the man who held it. Walter didn't shake. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat, as still as the dark, staring at the half-open door, where the forest writhed in the rain like a body in fever. He'd planned it all. No one would come that day. The weather was bad enough to drown the sound of a gunshot. He'd even lit a small candle. Not for light, but as a ritual, a final punctuation mark in a chapter no one had wanted to read. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. The world blurred, not from tears, but from sheer mental exhaustion. He no longer saw the line between living and dying, between light and dark. And then, through the edge of that void, he heard it, a sound. Soft footsteps, steady, hesitant, wet earth shifting. He turned his head. In the narrow frame of the doorway stood a stray dog, gaunt, gray-black coat soaked, ears folded low in fear and fatigue. Its eyes sparkled in the darkness, not from reflection but from something alive. A spark, a flicker in a world that had nearly gone dark. It didn't come closer, just stood there, watching him, as if it had seen men like him before, men standing on the edge, just one breath away from vanishing. It didn't bark, didn't whimper, didn't plead. It simply stood like a mirror, quietly reflecting his loneliness at him. Walter growled under his breath, not sure if at the dog or himself. "Go away, you don't need to see this." The dog didn't move. It stepped forward, then again. Rain lashed its back like a whip, but its gaze never left him. When it was just a few feet away, it lifted its nose and gently licked the back of Walter's hand, still gripping the gun. No one had touched Walter like that in years. Not a hand, not a voice, just that trembling, wordless touch of a creature who didn't ask who he was or what he'd done, only told him this: "If you die tonight, You die alone. I won't let that happen. Walter's breath caught. The barrel slipped from his fingers and clattered to the wet floorboards. He sank to the ground. No words. But the tears came, his first in years. And Scout, though he hadn't been given that name yet, simply curled up at Walter's feet, pressed his head gently against the man's shin. Like a vow, spoken without a sound. The dog stayed all night. Rain fell. Wind whispered through the cracks. It was too cold for sleep, but somehow Walter didn't die. Because death, when it's only yours, is easy. But when something alive needs you to stay, it becomes heavier than you expected. The next morning, the dog was still there, eyes steady, not begging, not afraid, just present, like the ground or the stone or memory itself, the only thing still real in Walter's fading world. Now, lying in a hospital bed, remembering it all, Walter shifted slightly. Scout still lay beside him, eyes closed, ears alert, as if he'd heard it all, relived the old dream, and didn't need sleep to know Walter was still here. Walter whispered, part confession, part thanks. I was going to die, but you chose for me to live. Scout didn't move, but his tail flicked, just once, like a small period at the end of a long sentence, still being written. Sometimes a dog doesn't show up for food, doesn't come to be loved. Sometimes a dog just lies beside a human at the exact moment that person is about to let go. And that's enough. Dusk slipped away from the window like a thin veil of smoke, leaving the hospital room steeped in soft, sad gold. Karen entered just as the sun disappeared behind the trees to the west, carrying a bowl of warm porridge and a few routine questions. But something was off. Scout wasn't at the foot of the bed. Walter didn't look up, but she knew he was awake. His body lay flat, eyes fixed on the ceiling, not counting seconds to recovery, but watching for a silent appointment with darkness. Karen set the tray down, her eyes scanning the room. "Where's Scout?" she asked, voice carefully casual. Walter replied without turning, checking the exits. His words were simple, straightforward, but they stopped her cold. In that moment, she understood. He had made up his mind. He was going to leave. She stepped closer, speaking gently. "Where will you go?" Walter didn't lie. "Back to the forest." The sentence landed softly, but it was a stone dropped into still water. Karen heard it. Not just resolve, but a fear that had outgrown the man himself. A fear not for his life, but for what he hadn't yet passed on. "To find the notebook?" she asked, already knowing. Walter nodded. A small nod, as if acknowledging that his survival now mattered less than the truth held in those missing pages. "And to keep this place safe," he added, looking at her for the first time. Karen stood motionless. She knew if he vanished like some runaway patient, the police would flag him as unstable. But Walter was not unstable. His eyes were clear. His frame, though thin, still bore the posture of a man who had once protected others. He wasn't fleeing out of fear. He was walking away by choice. When Karen stepped out to grab a blanket, she saw Scout waiting in the hall, standing still, head lowered, eyes on the back door, as if counting the seconds. For a moment she looked into Scout's eyes and understood. He didn't need a command. He already knew the path. Later that night, as the hospital hushed into its collective sleep, Karen placed a small envelope on the security desk. Inside was a note. "Patient Walter Briggs may attempt to leave the facility. Monitor but do not intervene with force. Local authorities notified." Then she walked away. No one stopped her. No one knew she was the one who'd unlocked the rear gate. In the darkness, Scout led the way, moving like he was following muscle memory. Each step steady, nose to the ground, ears forward. Walter followed. His legs are still weak. But whenever they faltered, he looked ahead to Scout. His slow, swaying tail, a metronome of unwavering loyalty, and found the strength to continue. They slipped through the overgrown trail behind the facility, past rusted fences, through knee-high grass, and into the tree line, where artificial light faded into a dense black soaked with the smell of wet leaves and cold soil. Walter didn't speak. Scout didn't bark. They were two shadows now. One once a soldier, one once a stray. Now walking together like two old souls returning to the place where memory sleeps. At the same time, in the local sheriff's office, an officer named Hale received a call. Karen's voice was soft, but it carried weight. "Walter Briggs left the hospital tonight. I believe he's heading into the National Forest. He may be carrying evidence or acting as a witness. Please don't go in hard. Just assist if needed." Hale paused, then nodded, though she couldn't see him. "We'll send a quiet team. No lights, no sirens, no cuffs." Karen hung up, slumped into her chair. She didn't know if she'd done the right thing. Letting a tired man and a dog who looked ready to collapse walk into a wilderness that could bury them forever. But deep down, she believed, if Walter chose to go back, and Scout was still willing to lead, then whatever waited at the end of their path was something too important to be lost again. Beneath the thick canopy, a light rain began to fall. Walter looked up. Cold drops stung his cheeks. He blinked quickly, clearing his vision, just in time to see Scout turn and look back. That gaze carried no question like, "Can you keep going?" Only this, "We've come this far. We don't turn back." Some escapes aren't about avoiding death. They're about reclaiming the reason to survive. And sometimes, the way back home isn't drawn on a map, but carved into the wet footprints of a dog who chose to walk ahead. The evening rain didn't last long, but it left a damp film over the ground, making each step heavier, and the cold seeped to the bone. Walter and Scout kept moving, silent as shadows spilled from a worn-out dream. No lights, no voices. Nothing to guide them but instinct, and the invisible tether between man and dog, forged from thousands of shared moments of survival in solitude. Scout led the way, nose low to the ground, tail held steady. Not tense, but not relaxed either. He knew this forest. He knew the scent of wet soil, the shift of the wind, the snap of a branch that might be deer, fox, or human. Walter followed, every step like a blade to his feet. He was no longer in a hospital gown. Karen had discreetly packed old fatigues and a weathered jacket into his bag. But the late spring cold still crept in, rusting every joint. It had been a long time since he walked this far. Even longer since he walked with no certainty of return. They crossed a shallow stream, water whispering over smooth stones. Scout forded first, then waited on the other side, glancing back. Walter trudged through, legs sinking into the icy flow, breath ragged as he fought his body. But he didn't stop, didn't complain, because ahead, Scout was waiting. Not barking, not pushing, just waiting, like a small flame in the dark. By the time they climbed the west ridge, the forest began to thin, but that's where the danger returned. Traps, some Walter had set long ago while living off the grid, still lay scattered in the tall grass. But some had been moved, sharpened, camouflaged. It wasn't wildlife being hunted anymore. Scout halted at a suspicious mound. A low growl vibrated in his throat. He stepped back, blocking Walter's path, tail rigid. Walter understood. He circled wide, ducking beneath a tight wire strung between trees. He looked at Scout and gave a small nod. A silent thank you. That nod carried all the trust between two souls who had crossed the line between life and death too many times to count. When the sun finally slipped below the horizon, the forest swallowed the last light. They stopped at a shallow ravine, sheltered by rocks, a low canopy thick enough to shield against dew. Walter collapsed onto the damp earth, leaning back against a tree, eyes half shut. Scout disappeared into the shadows. Walter didn't ask, didn't call. He knew where Scout had gone. And then, as if the forest had offered a gift, Scout returned with a small rabbit in his jaws. Its fur was ash gray, its body limp. He dropped the kill at Walter's feet and stepped back, waiting for him to do the rest. Walter's old hands still remembered. He coaxed a fire from dry bark and flint, driven not by hunger, but by the quiet promise that if Scout was still bringing back food, there was still a reason to stay alive. As the rabbit roasted, its scent drifted into the night air. Scout sat across from him. He didn't beg, didn't leap. He simply watched, eyes steady. Walter tore a piece and offered it. Scout took it gently, chewed slowly and silently. By the fading firelight, nothing was said, but a promise was renewed. They had eaten like this before. After failed hunts, in freezing winds, after the night Scout had finally stopped leaving and stayed beside him. Now, here again, in what might be their final journey, they sat like the last survivors of a world that forgot them, sharing a meal more sacred than any feast. The fire painted Scout's coat in copper and gold. His body, marked with scars, fur thin at the shoulder, cuts lining his back. But his eyes, dark brown, calm, sharp, and kind all at once, still burned with clarity, as if the entire world's truth lived quietly in those eyes. Walter watched him for a long time, then murmured, "If we don't find anything tomorrow, at least I'll know tonight why we came this far." Scout tilted his head, exhaled softly. No answer, but Walter knew Scout was listening, absorbing every word, as if it were the last command he'd ever receive. The fire died. The wind whistled through the ravine, and under a sky of cold stars, the two forms, one man, one dog, lay back to back, braced against the night. No one knew what the next day would bring, but one thing was certain: they would not part. Not in the forest, not even in the dark. In the wild and the long night, what keeps a person standing isn't instinct. It's the quiet presence of a creature who never turns away when you're lost. Dawn crept in. Its first pale beams pierced the dense canopy like threadbare strands of gold draped over dew-soaked trees. Near the cold remains of the fire, Scout rested with his head on Walter's leg, ears tuned to the faintest tremor beneath the ground. Though his body ached, he only half slept. An ancient instinct whispered, "When someone is under your protection, you do not sleep deeply." Walter stirred. A bony hand patted Scout's head. The gesture was simple, but in it lived a thank you too deep for words. He looked up at the gray, patchy sky, then groaned softly as he stood, joints cracking like dry timber. Scout rose immediately. His nose tested the air, his antenna to the world. Suddenly his ears shot up. His body froze, then a low warning rumble. "What is it, boy?" Walter whispered, hand drifting toward the knife in his bag. Scout didn't answer, of course, but bolted eastward, down a narrow trail choked with fallen leaves. Walter followed, step by step, trusting not just in the dog's nose, but in the truth that this dog had never once led him wrong. Less than 5 minutes later, Scout stopped. Ahead, hidden among leaning trees and tangled brush, sat a decaying tent made of tarps and rope strung across rotting branches. Trash scattered around, empty cans, plastic wrappers, burned paper. The air was thick, rot, old gasoline, and human sweat. It was a smell Walter hadn't known in years, but recognized instantly. The smell of things that weren't supposed to exist. Scout didn't bark. He crept forward slowly, head low, step by step, like he didn't want to frighten whatever was inside. Walter came close behind. Then they heard it. A whimper. Thin, broken, like a wounded bird. Scout edged up to the flap. From the dark folds of torn fabric, 2 wide, red-rimmed eyes peered out. A boy, about 10 years old, so thin his shoulder blades jutted out, hair matted with dirt and sweat, and a dried smear of blood still clinging to his cheek. His eyes were a mix of panic and despair, like a small creature cornered with no way out. He let out a cry when he saw the strangers and scrambled deeper into the tent. But in that very moment, Scout sat down. He didn't move forward. He didn't bark. He simply leaned in and gently licked the boy's wrist. a gesture so tender it felt like a whisper breaking the silence. The boy froze. Scout licked him once more, then let out a soft whimper, the warmest sound in that cold, merciless world. The boy looked up, lips trembling. "Dog?" Scout didn't react suddenly. He waited. No pressure, no force. And then, as if drawn by something beyond understanding, the boy slowly crawled out of the tent, inch by inch. His knees were bruised, his feet scraped raw by rocks and thorns. When his frail body finally emerged into the light, Walter stepped forward and knelt gently. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low and warm like the last fire of winter. The boy hesitated. "Sam." Walter looked into his eyes that seemed ageless, as if they had seen far more than any child should. And in that moment, Walter felt himself pulled back to an old outpost, to memories of border camps where children were trafficked like cargo across lines no one was supposed to cross. Faces erased from records, lives no one searched for. Sam was one of them, and somehow he had escaped, or had been left behind. "How long have you been here?" Sam said nothing. His gaze returned to Scout, as if everything left in the world he could trust was wrapped in that muddy, ragged coat. Walter didn't press him. He simply reached out a hand, and Scout, understanding instinctively, gave Sam's hand one final lick before stepping back, leaving a space for the boy to choose. Sam looked around, then reached forward and took Walter's hand, small, cold, trembling, but strong, and determined to live. Walter pulled him into an embrace. Sam didn't cry anymore. He just pressed himself into Walter's chest like a sapling curling into the shelter of a tree. Scout sat beside them, eyes not of a guide anymore, but of a guardian, watching over souls lost at sea. Some lives are forgotten deep in the forest, like seeds left behind. But if even one being finds them, not with command, but with warmth, they can still grow, even in rain, even in ash. That night, while Sam was curled up in Walter's thickest coat, dozing off by the dim fire, Walter sat silently in the tent, eyes fixed outside the canopy where the moonlight was smothered by heavy clouds. Scout lay at the tent's edge, head resting on his front paws, but his eyes were wide open, dark brown and locked on the shadows like a silent sentry. The forest wind picked up again, no longer gentle like breathing, but harsh, uneven, carrying a chill that didn't come from the mist but from instinct. And then Scout sprang up. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, but his ears stood straight, body taut like a drawn bow. His eyes narrowed. He slowly stepped out of the tent, moving westward toward denser undergrowth and interlaced leaves that usually hid movement. Walter watched. He heard nothing, but he had always trusted Scout this way. A moment later, Scout returned. His eyes had changed, not merely watching now, but warning. "Someone tracking us?" Walter whispered. Scout didn't answer, but dipped his head to touch Walter's shoulder. A familiar gesture he used only when they had to leave immediately. Walter gripped Sam's arm, waking the boy with a whisper. "Sam, wake up, it's okay. We have to move." Sam rubbed his eyes, voice still hazy. "Where are we going?" "Out of here. Someone's coming." The boy looked at Scout, and it was the tension in Scout's eyes that woke him fully. Without another question, Sam stood, clutching Walter's sleeve. They left the tent in silence. Scout led the way, not running or sneaking, but deliberately leaving a trail. Just clear enough for someone to follow, just enough to lead Walter and Sam safely onto another path. Wind howled through the canopy, leaves rustling, but Walter heard it clearly. Human footsteps, slow but heavy, as if tracking. The man wasn't rushing. He knew his prey was near. Scout turned left, pushed through thick brambles, intentionally leaving tufts of fur on the thorny branches, then doubled back in the opposite direction. His feet seemed to know every ridge, every slope, every hidden route. Scout wasn't just running, he was calculating. Walter realized it. He knew that while he and Sam clung to each breath to escape their pursuer, Scout was out front, guiding them and drawing the danger away. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked behind them. Birds scattered in a frenzy. Sam screamed and fell. Walter grabbed him, pulling him into the brush, trying to calm him. "You're okay. It didn't hit you. You're okay." But he knew. The man was close. Scout turned back. He didn't bark, didn't attack. Instead, he swerved sharply left and sprinted in the opposite direction, crashing through the undergrowth like someone fleeing in panic. Branches snapped. The earth thudded under his paws. From behind them, the man roared, "Damn it! You think I don't know that trick, you mangy cur?" Footsteps shifted, following Scout. Walter held his breath. The man was after Scout now. Seconds passed like centuries. Then the world was just wind, the pounding of Walter's heart, and Sam's faint breathing against his chest. Walter looked toward the direction Scout had gone, fingers digging into the roots beside him. Out there, his loyal friend was dragging the threat away alone. "Please come back," he whispered like a prayer. Deep in the forest, Scout ran like an arrow, his body blending with the dark, but his steps still heavy enough to sound like a group fleeing. His ears stayed turned back, listening for the man's footsteps. And for the first time, a hint of uncertainty flickered in Scout's eyes. Not fear for himself, but fear that if he didn't make it back in time, Walter and the boy wouldn't escape. Scout paused for a single breath, then veered suddenly down a steep slope, sliding through mud, plunging into a narrow rocky channel where sound bounced back like a maze. Another shot rang out. A bullet grazed the rock, whispering past his ear. But Scout didn't stop. Not once. Walter and Sam crawled out of their hiding place, exhaling. The eastern sky had begun to lighten. Walter whispered, not clear if to himself or the wind, "Scout, keep breathing. You have to come back." Sam gripped his hand tightly. "Will he come back?" Walter didn't answer, but his eyes, fixed on the dark forest, said everything. Scout would never abandon them, even if it meant dying. Some men will hunt you down, but only souls like Scout will trade their lives to shield what goodness remains. Dawn cast a cold silver over the forest, not the gentle light of morning, but a pale shroud, laid over the damp earth like a funeral cloth. Scout had not returned. Walter knew it, but he wouldn't allow himself to panic. Still holding Sam's hand tight, he kept leading the boy through the brush, retracing old paths toward a boulder he'd once used as a hideout, where there was a low hollow, enough to set a trap. Wind swept through, no longer the wandering forest breeze, but carrying the chill of human presence. So sharp, it stabbed Walter's nape, raising every hair. The man was figuring out their escape route. And when Walter saw the snapped branches on the right side of the slope, he knew. Only minutes left. They couldn't keep running forever. Walter crouched, picking up vines and sticks. In a narrow gap between two ancient roots, he began building a snare, the kind he'd used to trap civets, now meant for a man with a gun. "Sam, hide in there," he said firmly, pointing to a hollow lined with leaves. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." Sam nodded, eyes tight with fear. He understood something terrible was about to happen. He gripped Walter's hand for a long moment before slipping silently into the hollow. Walter stood, cold sweat on his brow, blood boiling like the old battlefields had never ended. But he also knew he didn't have the strength for a long fight. And just then, the sound of leaves crunching, heavy, rushed. The man was there. Without hesitating, Walter threw a rock far to the side, trying to create a false sound. But the man didn't fall for it. This one was experienced. He shouted, "Come out, old man! I know you're alive!" Walter gripped his knife tightly. Wind brushed his face, carrying the stink of cold sweat, metal, and another breath. Lower, rough, familiar. From the brush, like a living arrow, Scout burst forth. No growl, no bark, just his entire body launching straight at the man. The man jerked, turning his gun. A deafening blast. Everything shattered. Scout howled, a sound that tore the heart. and his body was flung aside, hitting the ground with a dull thud, fur matted with blood. But in that same moment, the man's foot slammed into the snare. Snap! The trap cinched tight around his ankle with a sickening crack, making him scream in pain. Walter lunged. He seized the fallen gun. In a single heartbeat, he had the barrel pressed against the man's forehead, all those years of war, loss, and hatred focused on his trigger finger. But then he stopped. Scout lay there, panting, blood oozing from his left shoulder. His eyes were still open, watching Walter. No pleading, no pain. Just a silent gaze like the earth itself. A look from a creature that had finished its duty, asking nothing in return. Walter slowly lowered the gun. The man cursed, howled, but his voice was smaller than Scout's ragged breathing. Walter turned to the dog and knelt. "You idiot," he whispered, his hand trembling as he stroked Scout's back. "Why do you have to protect me like this?" Scout shifted slightly, pressing his muzzle gently to Walter's hand. His eyes closed, breath fading like smoke dissolving in the forest wind. "No, no," Walter whispered, clutching Scout's neck, his heart suddenly hollow, deaf to the man's cursing nearby. Sam burst from his hiding place. He threw himself at Scout, sobbing, tears streaming. "He saved me." Walter didn't answer. He only nodded, as if realizing something too big for words. Then he gripped Scout's shoulders tightly, speaking softly. Not clear to whom. "I promise you won't have died for nothing. I'll bring it all to light, for you, for Sam, for what's right. A dog never asks if you deserve to be protected. It only needs to know you've hurt, that you've been alone, and that is enough for it to give its whole life to shield you." No one was prepared for that moment. No warning, no growl, no triumphant echo. Just a harsh, metallic crack that sounded like a blade slicing through flesh. Bang! A gunshot at close range, like a knife plunging deep into the heart of everyone who witnessed it. Scout fell right before Walter's eyes. His body jolted backward, all four legs spasming before crumpling onto the damp, musty forest floor, leaving a bright trail of blood across the thick mat of fallen leaves. A cry escaped his throat. Not long, not pitiful, but short, low, like a final breath forced through a lifetime of endurance. Walter dropped the gun he'd just wrestled from the criminal. It thudded to the ground, heavy, meaningless. He no longer looked at the man thrashing in the trap. The world around him shrank. The wind stopped blowing. The leaves stopped rustling. All the sounds of the forest drained away, leaving only one thing in sight. Scout. He lunged toward the dog lying motionless, dropping to his knees beside the blood-soaked body. He touched him, pressed lightly over the left side of the chest, where now only the faintest breaths remained, ragged and broken like mist. "Scout! Scout!" Walter called his name as if calling an old friend from the battlefield, one just struck down beside him. His voice shook, cracking like old glass. His throat was dry, his heart hammered. Not out of fear, but because something inside him was collapsing layer by layer. Scout opened his eyes. His gaze was cloudier than usual, dim like a dying flame. But the moment they met Walter's face, there flickered one last glint of light. Small, warm, grateful. As if seeing the most important person one last time before sinking into eternal darkness. Sam ran up, collapsing on the other side of Scout's body, his small hand touching the dog's back, then trembling violently at the sight of blood. So red, so real, so hot it felt like the pain in his chest pouring out. "Don't die, doggy, please!" Sam sobbed. He didn't know what to do, only how to call out, only how to cry. He'd lost his parents to cruel people, wandered the cold forest for days, surviving only because of one thing. His faith in Scout, in that wet nose, those pricked ears, and those gentle eyes like a mother's. Scout glanced at Sam. His head moved slightly, painfully, but with effort. A low whine escaped him, the only answer he could give the boy. "It's okay, kid. I did it. Walter cupped Scout's muzzle, laid his hand on the dog's forehead. That familiar feel, the short, weathered fur, always warm, was now growing cold beneath his fingers. "I'm sorry you shouldn't have jumped in like that," he whispered, eyes red and unhidden. "You're so stubborn, Scout. You've always been that way." Scout couldn't answer, but he licked Walter's hand. One short, tender lick, light as breath, then let his head fall into Walter's palm, as if his whole body was giving up, but his heart remained there, whole. Walter bowed his head, pressing his forehead to Scout's. They were no longer an old soldier and a dog. They were two souls bound by war, by years of loss, and by rebirth together in the wilderness. "You're the reason I'm still alive today," he murmured, tears falling. "You should have lived in peace, not died for me." The air thickened. Time slowed, each second dragging on like an age. And then Scout exhaled one last time, a breath longer than any before, as if pushing out every last memory from that tired body. His eyes closed, serene. Every tension on that worn face vanished, leaving only peace, as if he were sleeping, dreaming a warm dream by the fireplace, where he, Walter, and Sam were still together. Walter let out a sob. Not loud, but enough to break the heart of anyone listening. Sam hugged the now lifeless body, no longer crying out loud. He rested his head on Scout, as if clinging to a blanket he'd never let go. No one spoke. The forest was as silent as before, but now the silence wasn't threatening. It was a farewell, gentle and solemn. Somewhere overhead, a small sparrow sang, not bright or lively, but like a quiet prayer for a loyal soul just departed. Walter slowly stood. He removed the old scarf from around his neck, gently laying it over Scout's body. "You deserve to be buried like a soldier," he said. His voice no longer trembled. It was firm, as if strengthened by Scout's sacrifice. "I'll bring you home. I'll tell them. I promise." He bent down and lifted Scout, his arms steady. Sam walked beside him, his hand still resting on Scout's back, trying to hold on to the last of his warmth. Some deaths need no salutes, no medals, only a gaze, a hand, and a heart that will carry your name forever. That afternoon, white clouds drifted silently across a silver-gray sky. No rain, no wind, just a pristine stillness settling over the grounds of St. Mercy Nursing Home, where, for the first time in many years, people paused amid the weariness of old age to say farewell to a life that wasn't human, but lived as the last symbol of loyalty. Walter and Sam had returned at dawn. They had walked the entire long road back from the forest, their bodies exhausted, but their eyes no longer vacant as before. In Walter's arms, Scout was wrapped in a faded army poncho, leaving only his gentle face visible at rest, eyes closed as if sleeping, the fur around his muzzle still dusty from the road. Word of Scout's sacrifice had spread through the home ever since the local rescue team received Karen's urgent call. She was the nurse who'd tracked the old watch where Walter had hidden a locator. No one could believe their ears when they heard that a dog had guided, shielded, and saved the lives of an old veteran and a lost boy. Now, in the small garden behind the home, once just a quiet patch of grass for the occasional afternoon reading, staff, residents, and other old soldiers gathered, forming a silent circle around a freshly dug grave. There were no barricades, no flags draped over the mound, just soft soil, a simple wooden marker, and a single white flower leaning beside it, enough to hold the memory of a steadfast spirit that asked for no credit. Walter appeared in his old uniform, hastily washed and pressed, the shoulders frayed, the silver buttons tarnished, but still as straight as the last time he'd worn it before discharge. He walked slowly, holding Scout in his arms as if carrying a fallen comrade. His eyes no longer brimmed with tears, but were deep and clear, as though carrying the whole old battlefield in a single look. In front of dozens of bowed heads, Walter knelt and gently laid Scout in the grave. No one spoke. No one needed to. Only when he pulled a small wooden box from inside his jacket, opened it, and took out a tiny bronze insignia, the old badge of the reconnaissance unit he once led overseas, did he speak, voice hoarse but clear. "No one from my unit is left to wear this. I was going to be buried with it myself." He looked down at Scout, lips pressing tight, then curling into a gentle, painful, but peaceful smile. "But you fought like a true soldier. No orders, no weapons, just faith and love. You deserve it." He bent forward and pinned the insignia to Scout's neck, where the fur had been brushed smooth and clean. It wasn't shiny or valuable, but in that moment, it became the last symbol Walter could give, his final recognition that Scout wasn't just a dog. He was the last comrade he had left. "He's the last soldier I have," Walter whispered. A breeze swept through. The sky remained gray, but far on the horizon, a pale gold light began to glimmer. Sam stepped up to the grave, in his hand a tiny dandelion he'd picked on the way back. He knelt, laid it beside Scout's head, then touched the soil softly, whispering, "I don't know where you came from, but I know you're home." A few quiet sobs rose from the circle around them. Not loud, but real. Karen stepped forward, handing Walter a small spade. He accepted it with a nod and began to cover Scout with earth, each careful, deliberate scoop falling like a farewell, but not a burden. Everyone understood. Scout didn't die alone. He was buried in the place he chose to return to, among those he saved, besides the one he loved most. At last, Walter sat beside the grave, not leaving like the others. Sam sat next to him. They said nothing. Just two survivors, one old, one young, keeping vigil beside the friend they'd just laid to rest. And in that silence, someone in the home turned on an old radio. Through the crackling speaker came an ancient march, its melody strangely warm. Walter closed his eyes, his hand resting on the hand-carved wooden marker. Scout, forest watchman, friend, nameless soldier. Some funerals need no trumpets, because the loss is so great that only silence can speak for it. And in that silence, a dog named Scout became immortal. That afternoon, after Scout's funeral ended, Walter didn't go back into the home right away. He stayed by the grave until the last light withdrew from the grass, until fallen leaves touched the earth without a sound. Sam sat next to him, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes dry after crying them empty all morning. He didn't speak, but his small shoulders shuddered now and then, enough for Walter to turn, resting a hand on them as quiet reassurance. In front of them, Scout's simple wooden marker stood like a tiny milestone in a world that just kept moving on. And as dusk fell, Sam reached into his pocket and took something out. Scout's old leather collar, still smelling of earth and fur. He clenched it tight, then slipped it around his neck like an amulet, a piece of spirit that couldn't be separated. "I'll keep it forever," Sam said, voice small but firm. "I won't let anyone forget him." Walter looked at him in the slanting glow of sunset. In Sam's young face, he saw something he recognized from the mirror. Survival marked by loss. It was the first afternoon of a new chapter. A few weeks later, Walter formally adopted Sam. Karen helped finish the paperwork faster than he expected. "Given everything, there's no one else better," she said, then smiled quietly watching them, one old, one young, tending the small vegetable patch behind the home where Scout was buried next to the maple tree. Sam didn't call Walter Grandpa right away, but he followed him everywhere like a shadow. He learned to start fires, whittle wood, boil water, and even how to clean a gun, though Walter didn't use guns anymore. He never took off Scout's leather collar. Some nights, he'd stroke it gently before bed, as if he could still hear Scout's footsteps circling the bed, as if the dog was still there, keeping watch over both of them. Walter didn't ask much. He understood some things don't need saying to be preserved. Every Sunday, Karen would bring apple pie and a bunch of wildflowers to visit. She didn't talk much about Walter's past, or ask what happened in the woods. She just sat nearby, listening as Sam recounted how Scout saved him from hunger and cold, how the dog lay still in the rain to shield him, how those eyes shone in the dark like a lamp in his heart. One day, Karen noticed Sam carving something into a scrap of wood. "What are you making?" she asked. "A name sign," Sam answered without looking up. "A name for who?" Sam looked up, eyes bright. "For me. Walter says everyone needs a family name. I picked mine. Sam Scout Granger." Karen fell silent. She glanced over at Walter, who was quietly planting lettuce seedlings into the soil. He didn't turn, but his lips pressed tight, trying to hide a smile. Sam bent back over his work, whispering, "I promised I'd be like Scout. Never leave anyone behind. Never turn away when someone needs me." The old collar swung lightly against his chest, and for a fleeting moment, Karen believed Scout was still there, in the breeze, in the sunlight filtering through the trees, in every strong, quiet gesture the boy was learning. That night, Walter sat beside Scout's grave as usual. He didn't speak at first, just sighed, pulling out an unlit cigarette, then putting it back. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think all I had left was the past, but not anymore." The wind moved gently. A few maple leaves spiraled down, playing in the pale moonlight. "The boy is your next chapter, Scout. I see you in the way he walks, the way he listens, the way he's not afraid to love anyone anymore." He stood, brushing dirt from his knees, then spoke quietly, like sending a promise into the earth. "I'll teach him like you taught me. However much time I have left, I'll do it, for you." Scout was gone. But in a boy once abandoned, in an old soldier who thought his heart had emptied, the dog still lived. Not as a bark or a set of paw steps, but as a quiet vow. "I will never leave someone I love behind." News started spreading not long after Scout's burial. At first it was just a short local bulletin. A veteran and a boy saved by a stray dog in the cold woods. But like a spark catching dry straw, the story quickly leapt onto news websites and national TV channels. Within a week, Scout's name had become a quiet symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and friendship that crossed species. Headlines appeared everywhere. "Canine dog saves veteran and boy in freezing woods." "Touching tale of a soldier and an unknown dog." "Scout, a hero without a medal." Walter wasn't comfortable with any of it. He'd never sought the spotlight or admiration. Years of war had taught him the truest things were often the ones few ever saw. So when reporters knocked on the nursing home door, when thank you letters came in from rescue groups, veterans organizations, even a military representative, he just nodded quietly and retreated to the corner of the yard where he and Sam tended the vegetable patch next to Scout's grave. "They don't need to write about it," Walter muttered to Karen one day when she brought him a paper with Scout on the front page. "They don't know who he was." Karen smiled gently. "Maybe not. But others will know. And sometimes, being remembered is a way of staying alive." Walter didn't reply. But that evening he took out a small photo of Scout, the only one, printed from the home's old camera, and set it on the table by his bed under the dim yellow light. While Walter avoided the public eye, Sam met it with the clear honesty of a child who'd finally found a place called home. He told all his classmates about Scout, not bragging, not embellishing, but with a quiet pride, as if describing family. "He couldn't talk," Sam told a deskmate, "but he always knew when I was sad or scared. He slept close. If I had a nightmare, he'd put his head on my arm right away." Sam's teacher, a young woman who loved animals, heard the story from her students. She dedicated an entire class to the theme of courage, retelling Scout's story. Sam, sitting in the front row, still wearing the old leather collar like a rosary, listened with his head high. After class, she called Sam over. "Was Scout a rescue dog?" Sam shook his head. "No, he was my dog. Nobody trained him. But he saved me, and Mr. Walter, too." The teacher smiled, her eyes wet. Maybe for Scout, or maybe for the way Sam said Mr. Walter, like there was always someone waiting at home. A few weeks later, the nursing home got a letter from a big animal welfare organization. They wanted to hold a small memorial for Scout and name a new search and rescue training program after him. Walter declined to attend, but he let Karen and Sam go in his place. That day, Sam stood on a simple wooden platform, holding the only photo of Scout, looking out at the small crowd with round, bright eyes. "I don't remember Scout as a smart dog," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I remember he was the first one who didn't leave me behind. And I think if there's someone else out there who's been left behind, I want them to have their own Scout." The whole room applauded. But Sam only bowed his head, clutching the photo tighter, as if trying to hold on to a bit of warmth still trembling in his hands. That night, when the two of them got back home, Walter pulled out an unopened letter. It was from an old military unit where he'd once served. Inside was a single line. "We read the story. If Scout ever had a tattoo, he might not have been a stray. He could have belonged to a K-9 reconnaissance unit whose records were erased after a classified mission. No information is currently traceable." Walter fell silent. He looked over at Sam, who was sleeping in the next bed, clutching the old collar. For a moment, a flicker of doubt passed through him. But then he set the letter aside and picked up another piece of paper. Sam's rough drawing from that morning. It showed a dog standing in the rain, head lifted high, eyes looking to the horizon. Underneath, in the clumsy, uneven writing of a child, it read, "Scout, the one who never turns away." Some honors don't need to be confirmed. Some medals don't need to be awarded, because there are names that, once carved into someone's heart, will always be real. That night, when all was quiet in the nursing home, and Sam had fallen into a deep sleep, the old collar around his neck like an unspoken vow, Walter quietly put on his military jacket, took an envelope, and stepped out of his room. No one saw him leave. No one needed to. The path leading to the garden behind the home, where Scout lay at rest, was lit by a few small lamps lining the walkway. Their pale golden light quivered gently in the early autumn wind, like tiny flames guarding something fragile. Walter walked slowly, fingers lightly clutching the letter inside his coat pocket. Beneath his shoes, the dry, soft ground was scattered with fallen maple leaves, the same faded yellow he had always associated with partings. He stopped at Scout's grave. The wooden marker was still there, simple, careful, unadorned. The hand-carved words had darkened from the rain and sun. Scout, forest watcher, friend, nameless soldier. Walter knelt. His hands trembled as he pulled the letter from his pocket. The thin paper, neatly folded, was creased at the corners, as if he had taken it out and put it back many times before finding the courage to leave it. He placed it between two small blades of grass growing by the marker. The wind stirred softly. The letter fluttered, as if Scout were listening. Walter sank further to his knees, took a deep breath, then began to read. Not aloud, but like whispering to someone sitting just across from him, just beyond a forest. "Scout, I've never written a letter to a dog. But you were never just a dog. I've lived too long in the dark. Long enough to believe there was nothing left worth holding on to. Loss, my wife, my son, my comrades, whittled me down to a shell. I used to think I was just existing until I couldn't anymore. Then you came. No call. No reason. You just sat next to me that night, in the rain, like you knew I was falling. You didn't pull me up with claws or barks. You were just there. And from that moment, I began to come back. A day, then a week, then a whole decade. I never said it, but you knew. You were the last heartbeat I could still hear from myself. You saved me twice, once on that rainy night. The second time, when you jumped into the line of fire. I don't know why you did it. I don't think you even understood the danger. But you didn't hesitate. You didn't turn back. I saw your eyes in that last moment, not in pain, but in peace, as if you had done what you were always meant to do. People now call you a hero, a rescue K9, a warrior dog. But I don't think those words are enough. You never needed labels. You only needed to be remembered for who you truly were. Sam wears your collar every day, He tells all his friends at school about you, eyes glowing. The boy carries my name now, and I think you'd smile at that. And me? I just hope to live the rest of my life in a way that honors what you did. I'll teach Sam everything you taught me, about patience, about courage, and about staying even when everything else leaves. I don't have many years left, but in every day that remains, you'll be here, with me, in Sam's eyes, in every morning wind that moves the grass and tells me you're still running somewhere out there. Thank you. From your old friend, Walter. He folded the letter again, tucking one corner softly into the ground, like burying a memory. Then he sat back and looked up at the sky, where the stars drifted quietly like Scout's gaze once did. Calm, without demand, without need for an answer. A maple leaf fell, landing gently on the letter. Walter smiled. No bark, no footsteps. But he knew, in the breeze passing over his shoulders, something was still present, and that something was named Scout. There are thank yous that words can't deliver aloud, only through paper damp with soil, through an old man's bowed figure before a dog's grave. And in that quiet night, a faithful soul was engraved, without speech, without reply. 2 weeks after the letter was placed by Scout's grave, a large ivory envelope arrived at St. Mercy Nursing Home, bearing the official seal of the National Security Agency. No one expected anything important to come of it. But when Walter quietly opened the envelope and read the evenly printed lines, his hands froze, trembling slightly. At the center of the page, the headline read, "Commendation Notice, Posthumous Award of the National Medal of Valor, Honor Grade to Non-Military Entity, Scout." Beneath that, a bolder, weightier line. For the act of saving the lives of a U.S. veteran and a minor under dangerous conditions, despite no military training, we recognize Scout as a symbol of courage and unconditional duty. Walter read it 3 times. He didn't feel proud, didn't feel joy. Only a strange sense of peace, as if, at last, the world beyond had seen Scout not as a nameless stray, but as a soul who chose to stand in the ranks, not for training, not for duty, but for something purer than both: love and loyalty. The ceremony was kept simple, just as Walter wished. No media, no long speeches, only a small group of military representatives, some local veterans, the nursing home staff, and a few kids whom Sam had invited. No one wore medals, no one stood in a formal uniform. Only the autumn wind stirred through the garden, where Scout rested, and swept the courtyard where Walter stood silently by a small ceremonial table. At the table's center sat a deep blue velvet box. Opened, inside was a silver-plated bronze medal, an 8-pointed star with an engraving of a shepherd dog between 2 laurel branches. At the bottom was a navy blue ribbon, the symbol reserved for brave, unofficial acts carried out without orders, yet impacting the survival of others. A young officer gave a short statement, eyes steady, voice low. "We cannot confirm Scout ever served in the military, but that is unnecessary. Some actions need no paperwork to be recognized, and some souls, though never assigned to any unit, are still our true comrades." Sam, standing beside Walter, squeezed his hand tightly. Walter stepped forward, accepted the box from the representative. But he didn't open it, didn't pin it on, didn't pose for photos. He simply turned, walking slowly toward Scout's grave, each step pressing into the earth Scout had once walked on. Kneeling beside the marker, he placed the metal box gently in front of the wooden slab, where the carved words had begun to gray with wind and mist. "I'm not keeping this," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "It's not mine, it's yours, and I think you know you've earned it." Then he took out the small badge he'd pinned to Scout's collar at the funeral and placed it beside the metal box. 2 symbols, one from a past of battle, one from a present of recognition. Like 2 worlds finally reaching across the divide, joined by an unclaimed dog. No applause. Only Sam, bowing his head, whispered, "Scout would have liked this." Karen, standing at the back, held a bouquet of wild purple and white flowers, which she quietly placed beside the grave. She said nothing, but in her eyes, the autumn light reflected gentle tears. That night, Walter sat at his small desk. Sam was asleep on the bed nearby. On the table was a new photo, one showing him placing the medal on Scout's grave. A bent old soldier, solemn-faced, stood in front of a mound where grass had yet to grow. Walter pasted the photo into the back cover of an old notebook, the one he had rewritten from scratch, no longer to track shady deals, but to remember every moment Scout had crossed his life. Beneath the photo, he wrote, "You don't need a trench to be a hero. You don't need a command to save someone. You only need a heart willing to stay, even when the dark comes." And so, in a noisy world where the strong are praised, one untrained dog, without records, without a country, was honored not just with a medal, but by the hearts saved by the gentle touch of a wet nose and a gaze that never asked for anything in return. After Scout's tribute ceremony, Walter spent less time in the garden, not because he was avoiding sorrow, but because something had begun to shift inside him, quietly, like an old door creaking open, letting in the fragile light of memory into a room long sealed shut. He spent more time by the small wooden desk near the window, where afternoon light filtered through white curtains and pooled softly across the paper. At first, it was just scattered phrases, a sentence Scout had once spoken with his eyes, a place name from the war, a sleepless night missing his wife. But then they began to connect coherently, like a stream long blocked finally flowing again, not in sound, but in words. He began to write his memoirs, not to publish, not to be remembered, but to tell the story, as if not writing it would let it all vanish, and part of him would vanish with it. Each evening after dinner, Walter would sit in his armchair and open a worn, brown leather notebook. Sam, still wearing Scout's collar, would curl up at his feet, sketchbook in hand, eyes lifted to listen. Walter read slowly, voice raspy, sometimes halting, not from forgetfulness, but because the memories returned too vividly. Once, my unit was ambushed in the coast mountains. That night was so cold that even sleep made you shiver. I was assigned the machine gun, but I hesitated when I heard children in the woods. I thought it was a trap, and I didn't stop anyone from pulling out. 2 children were left behind. Sam didn't interrupt. He just sat still, listening with his heart, with a kind of purity Walter hadn't expected him to understand. After that, he continued, I stopped talking much, left the army, then lost my wife, then my son. Each death pulled me deeper into the dark, until I was alone in the woods. And then Scout came. Walter paused, looking out the window, where tree shadows stretched across the grass like nameless figures quietly walking through his memory. He didn't speak, he didn't blame. He just lay beside me, guarded my sleep, and woke me every morning. He taught me how to live again, without force, without questions, and in the end, he died without saying goodbye. He clenched his hands. Sam watched him for a while, then said softly, Then I think he wants you to tell it for him, so no one forgets. Walter nodded slowly, eyes misting. Not with grief, but with something else. Peace. The memoir grew thicker, page by page, not just of war or death, but the small things, too. The first time Scout barked at a lost fox in the woods. The time Walter had a high fever and Scout never left the tent. The night Sam cried on his first day at the home, Scout gently touched his shoulder with a paw, as if to say, It's okay. I'm here. Walter titled the memoir, The Boy Who Didn't Leave. No one asked if that boy was Sam or Scout, because everyone understood. It could be both. One afternoon, as autumn winds whispered across the old tiled porch, Sam took the first hand-bound copy of the memoir, the only one signed by Walter, and brought it to his school's small library, offering it as a keepsake. On the first page, in messy handwriting, he wrote, Written by someone who lost everything, told by someone who never gave up, for anyone who needs someone to stay. Scout was gone, but his story spread, not through newspapers or medals, but through an old man brave enough to face his past, and a boy who learned to speak of love with his heart. After all the stories were told, after the memoir filled out with the passing seasons, something else began to grow quietly inside Sam. Not in words, not in writing, but in color and image. On long, silent nights, as Walter slept soundly in his armchair, Sam would sit on the wooden floor, back against the window, moonlight pouring through the curtains, and draw. Scout returned on paper as if he'd never left. Sharp eyes, a thick, strong back, a calm stance full of quiet life. But none of the drawings felt quite right. Sam tore many up, redrew, repainted, until one day, as winter's breath chilled the edge of the porch, Sam looked up from his latest piece and knew this was the final one. In the painting, Scout stood on a hilltop where tall grasses bent in the wind. His stance wasn't fierce nor ready to strike, but calm, commanding, like a sentinel guarding the dawn. Ears perked, eyes lifted, gazing at a sky opening wide with morning light pouring through every leaf and blade. Behind Scout, Walter stood silently, his silver hair caught in the breeze. He wore his old uniform, not covered in medals, just simple and straight. In his arms, a folded flag, not raised high but held close to his chest, a quiet symbol of loyalty with no need for fanfare. The sunlight fell across them, a golden shaft diagonally illuminating the whole scene, as if the painting glowed from within. There was no foreground in the picture. Sam had left it blank on purpose. He wanted viewers to imagine for themselves what Scout was looking at, a future no one could know, a land he would never step into, but would always protect. When Karen saw the painting, she stood in silence for a long time. She didn't speak. She didn't nod. She just gently touched the thick canvas, feeling every line Sam had poured his young heart into. "Where do you want it hung?" she asked. Sam thought for a moment, then answered, "In the common room, so everyone passing by can see it, so everyone remembers Scout was here." And so, a few days later, the entire St. Mercy home gathered in the cozy room, usually used for reading, chess, and quiet afternoon music. The wall was cleaned. A small nail was carefully set. Sam's painting, framed in oak, was hung at the center, beneath soft golden light. Walter stood before the painting, silent. Then he closed his eyes, took a long, deep breath, as if he truly saw Scout standing there. Not just in strokes and color, but in breath, in light, in a love that never faded. Residents began to visit more often. An old woman who knitted said, "I don't know much about dogs, but when I see this painting, I feel safe." An old man in a wheelchair said, "It's like he's still standing guard for us." Over time, people started leaving small tokens beneath the painting. A dried maple leaf, a worn badge, even a missing coat button from no one knew where. As if Scout were still alive. As if everyone who came wanted to leave a piece of themselves behind for that nameless dog to keep watch over. Sam watched it all quietly, saying nothing. Then one afternoon, he pulled a small folded note from his pocket and taped it to the bottom corner of the frame. The note read, "You kept your promise. Now it's my turn. Some paintings aren't hung for art. They're hung because they hold what no one dares forget, a loyal dog, an old soldier, and a boy who was saved by a love that needed no words." The following spring arrived like a promise, kept gently. No rush, no noise. Just new buds peeking through the old wooden window frame, the chirping of young birds atop the home's roof, and the scent of fresh earth mingling with the early morning air. Time flowed like a thin stream, just enough to soften the cracks in the heart, just enough to dull the sting of memory, leaving behind something people could now smile at when remembering. Sam's painting still hung in the common room, beneath warm yellow light. But this time, as Sam passed by, he didn't bow his head, didn't clutch Scout's old collar. He simply smiled quietly as if greeting an old friend, knowing they were still somewhere out there, watching from afar. Then, one clear afternoon, as the lavender by the stone path began to bloom, Karen heard a soft bark from the backyard. At first, she thought it was just a radio playing somewhere. After all, since Scout's passing, there hadn't been a single dog at the home. But this bark was real. Not loud, not aggressive, but hesitant, shy, like its source wasn't sure it was welcome. She stepped onto the porch and squinted toward the vegetable patch, where Sam often planted carrots and wild daisies beside Scout's grave. There stood a dog, smaller than Scout, with a mottled coat of yellow and gray, ears drooping, and big, round eyes glinting with the last light of the day. It didn't move forward or backward. It just stared at Karen as if quietly asking permission. "Sam!" she called. Sam ran out almost instantly, eyes wide with wonder when he saw the dog. He stopped for just a moment, then knelt and opened his arms. "Come here, buddy. No need to call twice." The dog stepped forward, cautious but steady, and nestled into the boy's arms as if it had waited its whole life for that very moment. Sam laughed, a pure, ringing sound that rose into the lush green of the garden, not with sadness anymore, but fresh, blooming life. Karen bent down and stroked the dog's head, feeling the soft fur and the warm, trembling breath, like gratitude made real. "What's your name?" she asked gently, almost like a prayer. Sam looked up, smiling softly. Without needing to think, he answered, "I'm calling him Hope." Karen paused, not from surprise, but because the name was so perfectly, strangely right. Not Scout, not a replacement, not a copy, but hope. What remains after pain, after tears, after sacrifice. Walter, at that moment, was sitting on the porch, reading through the nearly finished draft of his memoir. He hadn't heard Karen call, but he heard the light, panting breath, and tiny footsteps of something that had run far to find a place called home. He looked up and saw Sam walking with the unfamiliar dog. And in that moment, Walter didn't see Scout. There was no illusion, no mistaken identity, but he saw a familiar look, the kind that says, "I'm here to stay," a gaze he once lost inside himself. Hope came closer and sat by his feet, nuzzling its nose against Walter's old, dusty shoes. Walter leaned forward and held out a hand. The dog didn't flinch. "So, you found your new friend, huh?" he said, eyes fixed on the calm, quiet gaze. Sam nodded with conviction. "Not to replace Scout, but the next chapter. I think Scout sent him." Walter didn't answer. He just gently stroked Hope's head, then looked toward the maple tree, toward the grave, where the late afternoon sun spilled like a gentle farewell. He spoke softly, unclear if to Hope, to Sam, or Scout. "Yeah, I think you're still guarding my sleep, even now that you've gone. Every soul leaves something behind when it departs. For Scout, it was loyalty. For Hope, it was a beginning." One windless afternoon, the sky crystal clear, the St. Mercy nursing home lay in peaceful stillness, as if holding its breath to avoid disturbing something sacred happening in the back garden. The sun's final rays slipped through the newly green maple leaves, laying soft golden lines on the tiled floor, touching Sam's painting in the common room, and finally reaching the figure of an old man sitting in a weathered wooden chair, the same one that had witnessed countless quiet moments between people and the things they couldn't name. Walter sat there, back slightly bent, both hands resting gently on his carved wooden cane, where the fading sun still picked out the words, "Scout, the one who stayed." Like a private ritual, he came here every morning and evening, not to do anything, just to stay in memory. In front of him, across a patch of grass, Sam was playing with Hope. The boy dashed around the base of the maple tree, where Scout now rested, laughing freely, the old collar swinging on his chest like a sacred pendant. Hope, quick and curious, chased after him like a loyal shadow, ears perked, eyes catching the sounds only dogs understand. Walter didn't call out, didn't step in. He simply sat, hands gently gripping the cane, as if holding on to a thank you he'd never quite said. He closed his eyes, and in the dim blur of aged eyelids, he saw Scout, not as death, but as life. The first time, the dog sat quietly beside him in a freezing rain. Those eyes, silent but star-bright, that bark that stopped him when he tried to disappear into the dark forever. Everything he had once forgotten about himself. Courage, trust, the ability to be loved, even when he no longer believed he deserved it. He whispered, his voice cracking like the breath behind a sacred truth. "You didn't just save me from dying, Scout. You saved me from myself." Hope suddenly paused. No barking, no chasing. Just stood still, turned, and looked at Walter. The eyes weren't Scout's, but they held something close. A gaze that knew, that understood, that carried forward. Sam stopped too, turning to look back. In the late sun, the boys' and the dogs' shadows stretched long across the grass like two soft lines, one full of life, the other full of strength. He raised a hand and called out, "Grandpa, we're right here!" Walter smiled. He didn't need to reply. He didn't need to stand. All he needed was to stay, in this scene, in this moment, with a heart now beating in peace like hope's gentle footsteps across the leaves. He knew it was finally time to stop holding everything so tightly. No more battles to fight. No more past to carry like a burden. Because Scout had helped him leave it all in the forest behind and step forward with something new. Not a dream, but hope. Real and breathing, running, living. And ahead of him, Sam. Not by blood, but by legacy. Not an ending, but the beginning. A dog saved a man not by action, but by being. And in that quiet presence, a life began again. Scout was not a trained dog. No titles, no rank. But he entered people's hearts with something no training could ever teach. Unconditional love. From Walter, a battle-worn old soldier who had shut himself off from the world, to Sam, a boy in need of a place to call home, and then the entire St. Mercy nursing home. Everyone changed. All because of one dog who never left anyone behind when they needed him. And what about you? Have you ever met a dog, or someone, who stepped into your life and made it worth living again? Share your story in the comments, because sometimes one honest story can reach a heart that needs it most. If this story moved you, like and share it to spread Scout's spirit, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future journeys between humans and dogs, those silent creatures who love more deeply than words ever could. Thank you for staying until the end. And if you see someone alone today, stay a little longer. Who knows? You might be their Scout.